Final session. In 1989, Al Bielek came forward to reveal his participation in the astonishing Philadelphia experiment and that he had survived time warping, invisibility, and electromagnetic zapping. Let's give a round of applause, if you will, to Al Bielek.
Thank you very much. Tonight should be considered part two of the lecture, which I delivered yesterday at noon regarding the Philadelphia experiment. Tonight we go into the Montauk Project and what happened there and why it's so significant, and particularly today, why it is significant. I'll just crank that one back until we're ready. The Montauk Project, what was it? What is it? It was a continuation of the work started during World War II and continued afterwards, which started the second phase, you might say, of the entire operation, began in 1947 at Brookhaven National Laboratories. Now, what happened preceding that, leading up to it? First of all, we had the Philadelphia experiment. It failed in 1943. It was scrapped, at least for the war years. It was revived in 1947. Dr. John von Neumann was asked to look into the matter again, see if he could salvage anything, maybe find out what went wrong. That became, at a somewhat later date, 1953, another part of the of the Phoenix Project. They changed the name again, too. It was no longer Rainbow Project. But during the years prior to World War II, and even for the first 2 years of World War II, there was a slow but steady trickle of German scientists, refugees, almost all Jewish, who fled Nazi Germany, and they were helped out in that desire to leave Germany and come to the United States by a man who had the proper connections with intelligence, with Interpol, and with the whole 9 yards of this sort of thing. And that man was my father, Alexander Duncan Cameron Sr. We don't know yet how he made these connections or why he was so well connected, but he was. In the period from 1933 to 1942, we brought out 9 refugee German Jewish scientists. They brought them in a very strange manner. They were put in a 12-foot case, which was typical for shipping ocean freight in those days, furniture and goodies for the store, the family store. And they would put a false room, a false intersection, which was outfitted for somebody to survive, like a bed, like some food, water, light, the proper facilities, and an air tube which went to the outside of the case. And this 12-foot on the side wooden box would be put on the top of the hold of the ship. The ship would ply the Atlantic, wind up coming into New York, and would unload at the harbor, and this crate would be moved to the store in Brooklyn. The man would be released, and he would be allowed to stay for a number of months in the family home on Long Island, the 23-room mansion, which I have shown you pictures of previously. And he would then be given a facelift and perhaps a change of hairstyle. And eventually, these 9 men became part of an ongoing project not at Montauk initially, but at Phoenix Project, as then located at Brookhaven National Laboratories. One of the men that was also brought over at that time was also a refugee scientist, and that was Herman Zionterman, who later became director of the Phoenix Project, working out of Lincoln Labs, MIT, in Massachusetts. So the war was over. We captured a lot of equipment from the Germans, a lot of paperwork, a lot of patents, a lot of trade secrets, 26 railroad car loads full. It was the biggest steal in history. And other things also came from Nazi Germany, which helped to finance this project. I'll get into that later because it's the latter part of the story. These refugee scientists were set up at Brookhaven to continue work which they had started during or prior to World War II, and that project was known as mind control. In other words, how can you influence the human mind and make the person, because of the influence on his mind, do what you want him to do, or forget what you want him to forget, or perhaps put in false memories. The earliest phases of this were primarily centered around the idea of controlling the person's behavior. And this work started at Brookhaven, went on from 1947-48 through a period of 20 years till about 1968. Now, Brookhaven National Laboratories was a national, and is a national laboratory. That means it is tax-funded, and because it is tax-funded, they must make monthly reports to the oversight committees in Congress and the Senate as to what they're doing, what they're spending the money on. Nobody read the reports in the early days. Nobody could care less, apparently, in those days, through the 40s and the 50s. But sometime in the 60s, mid-late 60s, somebody started reading these reports. And they found that there's a project going on at Brookhaven we don't really like the sound of. This is mind control. What are they doing? So they started to look into it and get some reports back, and the Senate has their own way of gathering intelligence. And they finally became very horrified at the possibilities that they might use this on the people in the Senate or the Congress. So the orders went out to cancel the project and kick these scientists out of Brookhaven, which was done. So what happened to them? There was a very large military base to the east of Brookhaven National Laboratories. Brookhaven is essentially central to the eastern part of Long Island. And on the extreme eastern tip, there was a military base now abandoned, has been abandoned officially on the government record since 1969, but it was a military base operational from prior to World War I until well after the end of World War II. Officially and originally, it was known as Fort Hero, an Army base, and it had 2 underwater entrance submarine pens for the U.S. Navy's use, which are still there, but they stopped using them in 1983. And this was the base which was still there in 1947. World War II was over. And then about a few years later, the Air Force came in and wanted space, which they were given to do some research work on high-powered new radar systems. They eventually developed there the SAGE radar system, which became the bulwark of defense for early warning radar over the horizon. And 25 of these sites were built around the periphery of the U.S. They were fairly high-powered. They would see over the horizon. But Montauk was the research point where they did this work. Eventually, they developed a newer system there at Montauk, which became known later as the BMU system. And this system, when developed, was moved out of Montauk and out of the U.S., went up to Canada and became the BMU's early warning system over the horizon. And they abandoned the entire SAGE system in about 1969. All the bases became surplus, as did Montauk. All the military officially moved off, and the scientists were left behind. How did they get there in the first place? Well, they went wandering around looking for a new home to continue their research. And they weren't very far away from Montauk, so they went up there and talked with some Army brass. And the Army people were very interested in what they were doing as a military project. They said, sure, you can come here and you continue your research. This was in '68. The base was not abandoned by the military personnel until '69, so there was about a year of overlap. And when the military personnel left, the scientists were left behind with the other people who were brought in to help support the project. And the base was carried on GSA, that's General Services Administration records, as a surplus, unused base. What a joke. It was hardly unused. And one of the other interesting sidelights was who picked up the tab for the power bill, because electric power had to be pumped in there for the research and all of the hardware which came later. And this electric bill was picked up by the New York State Parks Commission. It averaged $55,000 per month. So they consumed a little bit of power. And that was in the latter phases, perhaps not earlier. But these scientists were there. They continued their work, and were out of Brookhaven. And they were involved in what was generally considered phase 1 of the Phoenix Project. The Phoenix Project is actually an umbrella name which covers many, many projects. It's still used today, that name that is, to cover and hide many other projects. So they continued to work on the mind control systems, and in the meantime, of course, von Neumann had completed his work on the Philadelphia experiment, Project Rainbow, developed a system which was I won't say perfect, but certainly flawless in terms of the human element. The Navy bought it, demonstrated it, tested it on a ship in 1953. It was totally successful. And they then changed the name of that project from Project Rainbow to Project Phoenix, Phase 2. I'm using the P1, P2, or phase numbers for a reason, because it goes on beyond this. Very little, perhaps no work was done out there at Montauk itself relative to the invisibility project. I don't really know where they can carry the work on to continue the development, as it went through many generations of hardware, making it smaller, so today it is used on aircraft very readily. The Navy fighter aircraft are all equipped with the invisibility system. The Israeli fighter aircraft, the B-1 bomber, the B-2 bomber, the SR-71, and all the supercarriers have it. No problem with power or space on a supercarrier, but there's definitely a problem with space and power on a jet aircraft. But they did find a way to make it work in a smaller package, and it was installed on the aircraft. There was even a public demonstration of this capability over Hawaii 2 summers ago, now almost 3, in which I became involved because a radio announcer called me and asked what was going on, and I told him. They became invisible over the beach, flew into a cloud bank, were never seen to come out, but were heard to come out. They were getting a little bit brazen at that point. But that was Phase 2. The more important part of the Montauk project is Phase 3. And that was the development and the continuation of research begun during World War II on time travel. Very few people know that the Germans developed a working, somewhat crude, but working time machine in 1945, which they used and then destroyed before Germany collapsed. And Dr. von Neumann in the laboratories in late 43, early 44 also developed a time machine. And the sole purpose of that was to send me back into the 80s to find out, was there really a lockup with the Philadelphia experiment? Was he really there in the 80s? And bring back proof that this project and all of the hardware and everything related to it really existed. So I was the guinea pig for his new time machine, and I went back to the 80s more than once. Eventually he was satisfied with what I brought back in the way of evidential proof. And that was the end of that particular project. And of course, in 47, I was brainwashed, taken out of the Navy, taken out of the Navy first by a very circuitous route. If I didn't give you the story yesterday, I'll give it to you now briefly. On July 4th of 1947, I was picnicking with the family in a small town next to Los Alamos. Navy MPs came up, went through the formal procedure of identifying me. And when I identified myself as Commander Cameron, they said, well, you're under arrest. And I said, what are the charges? There's espionage. We have to take you in. So after a few minutes of a tearful goodbye with the family, whom I never saw again, I was taken in handcuffs to one of the famous Navy buses, put on a train in Albuquerque, went to Washington expecting a full court-martial, which never happened. They dropped charges, and then said I had a new assignment, sent me out to Fort Hero. Fort Hero was also a Navy base at that time. I knew nothing at that point about, at the time, that was the location of the future Montauk project. So I went out there expecting to have some work to do. After a short period, a few hours, I was told to stand in a certain magic circle and don't move, surrounded by 75 MPs with drawn weapons. You don't move. Suddenly I wasn't there. I was back in the labs in '83 at Montauk in the underground. I was told by a very tearful Dr. von Neumann that they were going to strip me of all my memories, put me through the age regression equipment, reduce my physical size of the body and age to about 1 year, and then plug me into another family in the past, namely 1927, which is what it turned out to be, and start life over. He said, I have nothing to do with this. I can't do anything to stop it because I'm only a consultant here now. So they did all of this. I wound up as Al Bielek and his family growing up from roughly the age 1. And went through life, grew up, went in the Navy again in 1945 and 46, again in electronics, but as a serviceman, a technician. Eventually went to school, acquired a degree in engineering and was a consulting electronic engineer most of my career from 1958 to 1988. I took a break in the middle and moved to California. Now, the rest of that project, which was ongoing, I eventually became part of, which was not known to me after it crashed in August of 1983. The memories came back later. But phase 3 was the development and the continuing work on time tunnels, time research, and what could be done with it. And the man who was in charge of this project was a Dr. Hermann C. Untermann, a physicist from Nazi Germany, who was smuggled out in 1938. He wanted out. He was forced to become a member of the Nazi Party after he got his PhD in physics at Göttingen University in Göttingen, Germany. And through my father, which he verified fully himself to Preston Nichols in one night over dinner with a few drinks, spiked drinks, became very loquacious and told the whole story, how he'd been smuggled out of Germany by my father across the Atlantic to the store in Brooklyn and so forth. He eventually became director of the project, and that was in 1977. The prior and original director was Dr. John von Neumann, who, far from being dead of cancer in 1957, was cured of it and was given a new identity under the Federal Protected Witnesses Program. Now, what were they attempting to accomplish in this third phase? To talk about, pardon the expression, an ordinary time machine, because they're hardly ordinary, but nevertheless, in the reference wherein you are only concerned with transporting yourself or an object through time, you maintain the same physical location reference. That is an example. If I were able to travel a year into the future from this point right now, I would not move from this physical location. And if a year in the future this room and this podium was still here, I'd be leaning on the podium a year from now, and probably none of you would be here. But if it went far enough into the future, the building might be gone. The difference between strict time travel and what they were working on at Montauk was the fact that they wanted to be able to control two elements. One was your position in time, the time reference, and the second one was your physical location reference. In other words, they wanted to be able to move you around like teleportation to any location they wanted, whether they changed the time reference or not. The beginnings of the research for this began in areas other than Montauk about 1963 and continued on in Montauk from that point on about 1968. It involved a part of the project which perhaps most people do not realize the extent of involvement of our government with aliens, I mean extraterrestrials, but due to this agreement, the treaty signed by then President Eisenhower in 1954 at Edwards Air Force Base with the Greys and others, we guaranteed their safety, non-interference with each other's society and civilization, an exchange of technical data and information, and we would also provide them with underground bases and a transportation system. And from that came the alien intervention in much of our scientific research. They added many aspects we did not have. We had the technology by the late 60s to build equipment which we didn't really understand at first, but they explained the principles and we were able to build it. So eventually, about 1973, they started ordering special hardware to modify the SAGE radar system into the new system, which was to be time tunnels, time tunnel travel. There was much other early aspects of this research. My book, the Montauk, or I should say Preston's book, the Montauk Project, goes into the details of the earlier phases of what they uncovered at first. They found that with the properly functioning transmitter, coupled to the mind of a human, after they got the basic groundwork solved, a person could think of an object like a chair or a table, and the transmitter, when on and functioning, would create that object physically in 3 dimensions, solid. You could kick it up and throw it around and do anything you wanted with it, as long as the transmitter was on. Eventually, The first phases, of course, when we turned the transmitter off, the object disappeared. They finally solved that problem so that when they turned the transmitter off, the object stayed. It was a real creation. That was one of the earlier phases of work they went through to learn what they could do with this transmitter. Dr. Unterman was given the charge by the U.S. government to do all the research he could in the space and time, learn all they could, and that he had to learn to work with aliens. He was a hard-headed German who perhaps had never been exposed to anything of this nature, finding he had to work with aliens. I'll go into how many aliens and what types in the slides in a little bit. But they worked on this project for many years and were very successful. It went through many phases, many changes. They tried to do it all with computers at first, and then one of the group called the Leverons, who had a great deal of computer technology, provided, they had their own computers, but they provided the transfer of data to our IBM 360s, because that was the best we had at that time, eventually to a 370. And Cray computers only came in near the end of the project, or at the end of the research portion of the project, about 77. But with these pieces of hardware they had, and they modified and they built to special order, they were able eventually to achieve some manner of time tunnel control. And it was sloppy at first, but they did, by 1979, perfect it. It took many changes. They finally adopted the idea that you can't control it completely with a computer. We don't have a computer complex enough that can handle this sort of thing. So someone came up with the bright idea, well, let's put a psychic in the loop here and pick up his energies as he thinks about whatever he's trained to think about, and maybe this will make the thing work in a reliable manner. And that was what they did, and they did succeed. My brother Duncan was the principal psychic, but he had to undergo very special training to be able to interface with a computer, actually a string of computers, before he got to the 360. And that made the project successful. They were able then to go anywhere in this galaxy, eventually, any time from about 100,000 years in the past to about, I am told, and I can't prove this statement, they claimed 1 million years in the future. I don't know if they did or not, but that was what we were told, because that became a major part of the project as Al Bielek. And that creates a problem in terms of understanding how I could live and hold down a career as a consulting electronic engineer all over the United States and also be working a good part of the time on this project. I've not been able to solve yet completely how that was handled. I know in part how it was handled, but not fully. This project went on and was used jointly by those who were interested in it, and I developed it privately because there was no government money in this project. It was developed by private interests. All of the scientists were ex-Germans or ex-Nazis. Nazism was considered dead, of course, by 1947. And all of these former scientists were involved in the project, as well as many alien groups, and they split the usage of this station between alien interests and what loosely could be called government interests, largely private interests. Nonetheless, there were government people involved. The Air Force was heavily involved with this project in terms of representation, observance, and putting some inputs as to what they wanted to try to do. Same went for the Navy and the Army. They all had personnel there, but none of them were paid by the Montauk Project. They were all paid out of the Pentagon or wherever else they were stationed normally. All of the personnel there were what they call TDY, temporary duty, not the civilians. How they handled the finances for them, I don't know, because most of them were never paid, to my knowledge. And that was one of the reasons for maintaining a cover of an outside career. They worked the blazes out of us, but we never got paid for it. The government, or whomever, likes that. Nonetheless, the project went on, and they did succeed in doing many things. Among them was a project involving interfacing with Mars. In case you people don't know it, I suggest you either acquire a copy of the book or the video entitled Alternative 3, which documents the history of our being on Mars in 22 May 1962 in a joint American-Russian project which has a remote control landing. There was no personnel involved, but they had TV cameras and sent the images back to Earth. How this was uncovered, there's a very interesting story. It was put on by Anglia TV in April of 1977, and they were royally slapped on the wrist for doing it. They had to recant or lose their license, according to the English, what we've heard since, and the English government didn't like it. In any case, there were definite grounds for saying that we could live on Mars. They had all the proof in terms of the gravity, the air pressure, the temperature, and moon bases were developed in the mid to late 60s, and from there they transferred to Mars, and we have colonies today on Mars. But one of the interesting things that turned up, and of course NASA has published some of the pictures of the face on Mars and the pyramids and a little bit about the ruined cities that have been found, the colonists found entrances which were totally sealed, leading obviously into some underground system. They couldn't break through. They needed heavy earth-moving equipment, CATs, which they simply were not able to get up there. And they finally radioed to Earth and mentioned this, and it got to the Montauk Project, and the people there said, well, give us some coordinates where on the surface of Mars you think these underground caverns are located. Well, in the computer complex, they had all of the information about celestial positioning of the planets in our solar system and the progress day by day, hour by hour of a planet. So it was no problem to plug in a coordinate and do the proper mathematical manipulations to figure out where to send a tunnel to contact the surface of Mars or really the underground. But they didn't take any chances at first. They sent a camera to see whether the camera wound up in solid rock, which was no problem with the camera, or whether they got a returnable, usable image. Brought the camera back and they found that it had been in a cavern and they got pictures. So they sent a crew, an exploratory crew there many times. Duncan and I were in that a number of times. Huge underground, all abandoned. A lot of artifacts, records, obvious artifacts of an ancient civilization which had died out quite some years prior. We estimated maybe 10 or 20,000 years prior. NASA estimates the surface works died out, the surface civilization died out perhaps 300,000 years ago. It's a very crude estimate. They don't really know, but it's an estimate. But that was one of the uses of Montauk, to explore the underground of Mars, quite successfully. Where else they used it, I don't know. But some of the other things they use this project for, I can tell you. Let's look at this point at some of the slides, and I'll give you a little better background and feeling. And I will also mention before I start the slides that this project was sabotaged and crashed on the night of 12 August 1983, and how I will go into in the slides. Everyone was given their debriefing, which is a polite term for brainwashing, starting January 1, 1984, and continuing for several months for some people, so that they wouldn't remember being part of this project. Nothing was done to interfere with their normal memories of whatever they've been doing as a civilian outside of this project. But this project was erased. It didn't last very long, because in 1985, at the invitation of Preston Nichols, he and my brother Duncan, whom I didn't know then was my brother, made a trip out to Montauk and surveyed what was left. And that becomes an interesting story and the rest of it. But let's go into what was going on and give you some flavor and view of what the base looked like. First of all, a map of Long Island to point out to you where the base was and is still, because the remains are all still there. All the way out on the eastern tip of the island, the South Fork, there is a lighthouse called Montauk Lighthouse, there is a state park, and there is the military base called Montauk Air Force Base. We still have recovered the signs and the pictures of the signs from that era. But that is basically where the Montauk project originated and took place. I might add, this was only one of 25 SAGE sites. We still don't know where all the SAGE sites were, though we know where about 12 or 14 were. The information we have is that they were all operational at one time. Towards the end, in 1982-83, there were only 3 left operational, and they were tied together to Montauk as the master control station because of the timing systems and such through satellites. But let's go on here and I'll show you a little more. Now, as I mentioned, in August of 1985, I was invited by Preston to come out and visit him in his laboratory, and I stayed 2 weeks. And he, I, and Duncan, at that point I didn't know was my brother, half-brother legally, took this trip by his van out to Montauk. He said, I want to show you some things on the eastern end of the island, see what you think about them, what you feel about them. So we're passing the town of Montauk and a rise in the hill out there. It's not very high hills on the eastern Long Island. The first view you have is of this view like that is there of the radar tower peeking over the hills, as it were. You get a little closer, you see the tower is still taller, and you begin to get an idea of how big it is when you get on the base. What we did was we went to the public park, parked the van, and walked a short distance to a roadway which led around gates which were already down, largely trampled down. The base was wide open. This is in 1985, August. And we made a grand tour, the 3 of us, to see what we could see. So we get on base, and you see this radar tower. This was the original SAGE radar system in the radar tower, and the antenna was still very much intact. These pictures were taken in May of '86, by the way. Some later ones I have were taken much later. But you get up close, and you can have some idea of the size of this thing. That tower was equivalent to an 8-story tower, though there were only 4 or 5 floors in it. The antenna itself was 60 feet high from bottom to top and 120 feet across, and weighed about 125 tons. The drive motors and assembly, gearbox assembly on the base was another 125 tons. We had 250 tons on the roof of that building. Needless to say, the building was very heavily reinforced. It was built for the purpose of supporting that antenna system. The reason it was so heavy was they wanted it to be able to acquire and hold a target, a radar target, in winds up to 115 miles an hour. And the winds get rather stiff on the eastern end of Long Island in a storm. I think that's about as sharp as we'll get it. It's a broadside view of the antenna. It'll give you a little better idea of what it was like in terms of size and spread. It's still there today. Some of the old feed horns was all a very high-powered RF. We didn't realize until fairly recently how high-powered it was, because the original SAGE system only used 2 ampletrons driving the antenna, which were by manufacturer specs capable of 1 megawatt CW output at 475 megahertz. They could be pulsed to about 25 megawatts. They used 2 in parallel in a special formation. It was not strict parallel. But the feed system had largely collapsed between the time when the antenna and the system was abandoned in '83 till we went on the base and took these pictures in May '86. But this is what we saw in August of '85. There's another view of what we saw there. And you had on the top of that antenna tower 2 strange other antennas. This one was a directional, rotatable with all the cables. And from that antenna tower, as part of the documentation in '86, we took pictures in every direction. There was a special photographer there who had a group in from Phoenix who was trying to document and prove in some manner whether or not this project, which I had discussed with somebody in Phoenix in Christmas of '85, involved a diversion of money from a regular authorized government project to an illegal project. The attempt was to prove this was the case, and a major investigation was underway by none other than then Senator Barry Goldwater. We were never able to prove it, but we certainly did find a lot out. Now, these pictures, all taken from the radar tower, show the size and extent of the base. And there were other radar installations also long since removed, and those flat towers are once domed. But this gives you an idea of the size of the base and some of the structures we saw from the roof. Roadways leading all over, barracks which were once used. More of the same. There were headquarters buildings for the officers, there were barracks for what enlisted personnel were there. And then we went inside the radar tower. There were a few more pictures, I don't have them. But this was the main AC feed transformer off the line, three-phase, 440 volt from LOCO, which provided, when rectified, the power for the system up in the radar tower. There was more to the system than what was in the radar tower. This was one of the high voltage transformers, the modulation transformer. It gives you some idea of the size of that equipment. That transformer stood about 4 feet off the floor. That is to say, it stood from the floor 4 feet up. It was very heavy, perhaps half a ton. And the output stage, the final choice, was a specially developed amplitron by Raytheon. That's one of them. There were two. They were liquid cooled. They had a huge magnet around them. And they had hardware tongs, if you will, to take the tube out if it failed, because this did happen, and replace it. The second one there had part of the top removed. Liquid cooled up here. This doesn't say anything about what we found eventually was installed in the basement, as we called it. This is the traffic circle and the famous grass circle where I was told to stand when I was sent back there in '47. The military base then looked a great deal like it does now. There was very little difference. As the military bases usually don't change that much until the Air Force came in and added a few things, including the tower. But in the process of our investigation in 1986, because I went home, eventually flew back in May of '86, home being Phoenix at that time. And we came back in May '86 with this group. We took pictures and we found this strangely smashed wooden building. It's hard to explain how the building had been destroyed. It looked almost like somebody had hit it with a giant fist. In a certain sense, that was true. From that radar tower, we caught some strange images. This was taken with a standard 35mm camera with standard film. We found off in one section of the field to the north this piece of concrete, which is remains of the fortifications used during World War II. Concrete, nothing to reference the physical size, but there we found this strange looking creature. So we blew the picture up. That will give you a little better view of what it looked like, almost a perfect Sasquatch. Not visible to the eye, but was visible to the camera, and since then also to camcorders. It's hard to explain why you can't see with the physical eye, but the camera can. This is a known phenomena. I'll point out something about it. It didn't move and hasn't moved since. It's a lot clearer in the prints I have, because the slides were taken from 8x10 glossies, which were given to me quite some time ago. Preston Nichols has the original slides from which the prints were made. They are slightly clearer, but not that much. But what we learned was that this project, after Duncan and I arrived as Edward and Duncan Cameron from the Philadelphia experiment, were there on the base approximately 12 hours, from about 2 in the morning till approximately 2 in the afternoon. And we went back to the Eldridge. A plot had been conceived about some 6 weeks prior by Preston, by Duncan, and a number of other people, and I was not part of it, which was to bring the station down because they felt there were so many things wrong and evil going on there. It just decided it was time to end it. So they resorted to a mental implant in Duncan's mind and a command set up in the subconscious that when a certain phrase was spoken to him, he would release from his subconscious, much like the movie Planet X, the monsters of the id and all of that. This creature, which would then go into the transmitter, and it had full control over our reality, or creating an artificial one. It created this thing in terms of the mental image into a physical, solid, three-dimensional creature, estimated to be about 12 feet high. And this was seen stamping around the base after we had left sometime late afternoon. And it tried to get in the radar tower and could not. And this is reports by people who survived and saw this. I was not there when this happened. I was told to take a hike, a vacation, and I was not there when the final demise of the station occurred. This creature was seen running all over the station, destroying buildings, picking up people and throwing them against concrete walls or whatever, and, shall we say, wrecking people, smashing them. The then station master, Jack Pruitt, got word of this, told people who were not necessary to get out, and that the orders were to kill the power because the power for the station then was being fed through, at least in the radar tower and the surface operations, from Lilco, that's Long Island Lighting Company, approximately 4 megawatts of power. And they said, kill the switches, pull the power. They couldn't. The switches, like on the Eldridge, were frozen. So the word went then, cut the cables with axes any way you can. So they cut the set of feed cables. The lights and the power remained on in the tower and in the station. They found a secondary set of cables, cut those. The lights went out, but the station kept running. At that point, the then station master, Jack Pruitt, who was Air Force, said, we have a real problem, everybody clear out. And he and Preston Nichols, who was still there, either separately or jointly, acquired, which were available on the station, acetylene torches, portable type, went into the interior of the radar tower and started cutting cable feeds between the modulators, the transmitters, and the computers. And when they cut enough cables, they quite literally had cut the brain apart running this thing, and it collapsed. What had happened and what finally occurred was that this thing had sort of developed its own personality and was quite capable because it had all of the cutting edge of science and technology that was necessary stored in the computers on base. And it knew how to tap the Dirac-C, a source of unlimited energy. Some of the so-called free energy machines do tap the Dirac-C. There isn't really a free lunch, but it's a means of tapping power which is not conventional. And the whole station knew how to do it. When enough cables were cut, the station went down and this creature disappeared into wherever it went after a few hours and apparently froze in space and time at this location because it's still there today in the same spot. But we had proof, photographic proof, that this creature did once exist, according to the legendary stories we had heard. The people who saw it didn't consider it a legend. Now, I've mentioned previously that this station involved cooperative efforts with aliens. Now, what kind of aliens did we have? The agreement in 1954 made with Eisenhower and there were certain alien groups opened the way for large numbers to come in, and they were interested in giving us some technology because they wanted us to build something. And it was a joint effort to build this Montauk operation, not the Prestige radar system, but the time tunnel system, which was later developed using elements of the SAGE system and the radar tower and the underground. Now, what am I talking about in the underground? Originally, prior to 1928, there was an underground base, quite level, flat. There was no hill out there. And it was built by the military prior to World War I with one level of underground. It's probably connected with the bunkers for ammunition and all of that. In 1928 and 29, the Army Corps of Engineers came in under somebody's direction and added 5 levels above ground of concrete and steel, a huge installation. And when they were done, they covered it over with dirt and planted So that became the new underground, 6 levels of it. And of course the radar tower had a freight elevator which went down through all 6 levels. A lot of equipment was stored in the true underground, as we called it. And all of that equipment, most of it probably is still there today. And after the station collapsed, which was on the night of 12 August of 1943, we were told by a survivor that about a week later, a contingent of Marines came in with machine guns and shot and killed everything and anything, whatever, that moved. And after they left, about a week later, 26 truckloads of concrete were brought in, and they sealed up all the entrances to the underground, all the stairwells, elevator shafts, including the main one in the project. But before this happened, the project was very much alive and viable, and part of the project involved aliens. So what kind of aliens did we have? There were several groups. One of the principal ones was the reptilians from the Orion complex, which, as I show in this slide on the left, these are not photographs. These are sketches drawn by people who had seen them and been there, either abducted by these creatures or had direct physical contact with them as part of the project. You had the standard Orion type, who was a reptilian, and on the right the picture shows a draconian, who's typically about 7 foot tall. The ones that usually control the little grays, which I'm sure some of you have heard about, and figure quite heavily in the literature by Schreiber and others in terms of abductions. The one on the lower part is one of the grays. They came in various sizes from 3.5 foot to 7 foot, such as the partial picture of the one on the left, which was one of the old Zeta Reticuli grays, about 7 foot high, and very few of them, reputedly 1,200 years old at the time when they were there, and we don't know how long they lived. The average gray had a lifespan expectancy of about 350 years. They lived a lot longer than humans. They also lived underground and avoided sunlight. Maybe there's a clue there. Anatomically, the grays looked stripped much like this. They were sexless. They did not procreate. They reproduced by a form of cloning and using surrogate mothers who were typically human mothers, where somehow the seed was implanted and they went through the first trimester, and then the incomplete child was removed. There's thousands of medical cases and documentation of women who've had a baby starting to grow, and then suddenly it isn't there anymore. This was what happened. These aliens were using human mothers as surrogates, and after that they were taken to the underground laboratories and they were grown the rest of the way in their underground systems of tubes, not vacuum, but liquid tubes and other systems, until they were adults. They were grown and born, if that's the proper term, as an adult, about 3.5 feet high. They didn't have any children. They looked very much like this. They had very strange internal structures. They could not eat. Their digestive tract was almost totally atrophied. And they had to absorb nutrition by sitting in it in a vat, absorbed it through their skin, and about 2 weeks later they excreted the waste products again through their skin. And the food which they used, not very pleasant to consider, but there was an enormous amount of cattle mutilations over the years. They were using cattle blood mixed with human blood because they were also abducting humans for food. And that was one of the reasons why in 1947 the first discovery of crashed UFOs in the Bracewell Ranch in New Mexico, which was openly announced in the press after the crews got in there from the government and found not only remains of aliens, but remains of human body parts. The lid went down and has been down ever since. And then, of course, they had the press conference the next day and announced there was a weather balloon that crashed. And this, of course, has been the pattern ever since. The interesting thing about the grays is they have 4 fingers, and they have 4 bones in each finger, unlike humans who have 3. There was a lot of studies been made of them, but these grays were also underground, underfoot most of the time, but they were part of the project. There were other groups, which we do not have slides of, which included The group from Antares, they were very human. You couldn't tell them from a human stripped. They were very friendly. And they didn't do anything. They were just there as, apparently as observers. We also had another group. This is the ones from Sirius, the Syrians from Sirius A, who were very intelligent. They provided most of the technical backup and technical expertise to the Orions and as well as to us. I don't know how long they lived. They were nearly human, but they had strange features, somewhat wrinkled skin, and vertical slit cat eyes. They tended to be friendly at times, but they disdained humans like most of the others. The attitude, I might add, having worked with them, of the Orion reptilians was of absolute disgust bordering on hatred of humans. They were literally using us. They were ordered to do so, to work with us, so they did. Only one draconian, and it was interesting that the alien interests were represented by one man who had his own office, or I should not use the word man, one of the aliens, a draconian, who represented all alien interests. He was not high up in the hierarchy, but he was higher in pecking order, if you will, than Jack Pruitt, the station master. There was a total hierarchy beyond that that went up to Herman Siantaman, who operated out of Lincoln Labs, MIT, in Massachusetts. He was the administrative director of the entire project, including all the locations. But he was still not the top. There were 3 levels above him that went into the military. And I will not go into that because of the names involved, and these people are still alive. Some of the things which have been reported, which were done with various means of mind control, brainwashing, implanting ideas, part of this was alien and part of this project was human. But the Syrians were very heavily involved with this, and they developed some of the hardware, including one of the conditioning chairs, if you will, which was as shown on that slide, very similar. And this was used for brainwashing people. This was probably the grandfather chair, if you will, to what was later used in conjunction, direct conjunction with the project. What they found as time went on was that the computers we had were incapable of handling all the data and the functions of developing a time tunnel and directing it as to where it should go. So somebody got the bright idea, well, let's try using psychics and wiring them up, so to speak, and it worked. These psychics were very sensitive. They were well trained. They went through another project called the VIR project down at in Maryland, Chesapeake Bay operation, and they were trained to think automatically in terms of symbolic logic. No matter what they thought of, they would come out from their brain and their nervous system as a form of symbolic logic, which would then feed through the computers and be interpreted and actually give the instructions to the computer as to where that tunnel was to go or what time reference they were to go to and so forth. I might add, the individual psychics who were trained for this, when they were doing this, were not in their normal conscious state. They were in a totally strange, different state of mind, unconscious so far as the normal conscious functioning of the human mind was concerned. Well, the project crashed. We made many visits out there. Eventually, my memory came back in May of '88 from visiting at the site the second time. Duncan and Preston had been out there many times in between and had insisted for months that I had been a major part of the project as Al Bielek. I said, I have no memories of this. I couldn't have been. They said, oh, yes, you were. We know it. Well, eventually, in May of '86, before I moved to Long Island, my memory started to come back to that weekend, and in the time period I remained there, almost 2 weeks, that I had indeed been part of the project, and how much and how extensive took quite a bit of time to recover. And from May '86 onward, through that summer, I eventually made the decision, because work was not available to me in Phoenix or in other areas I went. I moved to the island, Long Island, and obtained work in electronics. Remained there until the job blew up because of the economic downturn, which started to hit Long Island in '86, and eventually moved back to Phoenix because of work offered there in March of '87, and I've been living in Phoenix ever since. But many times we went back looking for evidence and taking some pictures. And then came, strangely, in the summer of '92, rumors to Preston that this project was back online. So we went out there looking for evidence of all kinds of things, particularly any evidence would prove that there had been new installations of equipment that would tend to verify it was online. We measured the output of RF through various radio receivers and spectrum analyzers, and there's no question they were transmitting. But we found some other things. One of the items of interest is this picture showing that Fort Hero had been turned over to the town of Montauk to be developed as a public park, which has never happened. Part of it is open now for fishermen to go out on the cliffs and do their fishing, if you will, from the cliffs either on top or down below, because there is access to the ocean level. We found a brand new Coast Guard station out there. This may not have any connection with the project, but nevertheless we documented it. Its antenna, the control box, the loading coils and connections, and of course the actual section where the two transmitters were located. It's not very bright in there, but it shows the trailers where the equipment was located. It was not high powered, but equipment was set up with the antennas apparently to handle much more power than was then being pumped into it. We continued wandering, and we were able, this is very faint in this picture because some of the lighting was not good, we found a new telephone junction box in the ground. We continued to look, and we found a great deal more than that. We found telephone boxes, brand new, mounted on telephone poles, which indicated that a new telephone line installation had been brought in perhaps in the last year. Really need a little more light from the slide projector, but it's limited to what it can do. We found brand new transformers on poles there, a lot of new telephone poles. If it was an abandoned base, why were they maintaining the power lines? And why did they have 3 brand new transformers in with a 3-phase feed system and a digital meter with a 200-to-1 current transformer step down to read the power on each of the 3 phases individually and the total sum power? This was on the side of a maintenance building. The cables went to the ground, went over to the maintenance building, and in the maintenance building was nothing but a truck and some fuel stored in the back. A lot of power. We found out since those 3 transformers feeding power had the capability of feeding in 4.5 megawatts of power, and this is official information from LOCO, that the installation was made about a year prior to these photos. We found new coax cable runs in the old runs. There was some new cables in there, which indicated somebody was doing something, and they went out to the radar tower. Now, this is a more recent photo of the radar tower. It still looks much like it did, and you can see from another shot how large it is, and it's still very much there. It hasn't fallen down. I doubt that it will. We found a lot of evidence of continuing work of some kind to refurbish the station. One of the things we found was a steel door on the inside entrance to the radar tower. It wasn't there a few years ago, but suddenly they decided to seal off the entire radar tower. The steel door was quite heavy, double padlocks, and people had tried to pry their way in and were unsuccessful in doing so. Again, some views of the old radar installation and where the control motors, there were 4 of them that drove the system. They all have been removed, by whom we don't know, but the remnants of the gearboxes and the slides where the motors were are still there. And in January of this year, we went back to do a commercial TV production in conjunction with a man by the name of Peter Belts, who had connections to have this produced on TV in Japan. It's still not finished, but a lot of footage was shot. I took a lot of pictures, and Preston Nichols did his own footage in terms of video. But this was our group on the roof of the radar tower. It was a cold day. It was January 14th. Another view of Preston Nichols under his hood. Some more shots of the antenna tower. And if you look carefully, you will see a brand new coax cable. We found it in the runs coming up through the tower, going up to the top to that antenna system, apparently, again, operational. The radar antenna has never been used since. And the two ampletrons and all of the other drive equipment is now history so far as the radar tower is concerned, but we don't know what they're doing underground. A view from the tower currently, that is January of this year. And in one of these views, if you look carefully, you will see Junior, as we called him, the Sasquatch-like creature, still there. He's visible in this shot, but not on the screen. It requires more light or a slide viewer. Another shot of the tower. And here was the steel door, barring access. But somebody came along and very conveniently blew a hole through the side of the concrete. And we were able, of course, then to get into the tower. That's how we got to the top and took those other pictures. And this was a picture of Peterbilt's looking out from the inside. It was negotiable. Even Preston could get through. So another point of interest was the transformer switch yard with all the old transformers rotting. But we found one new one. Notice the label, non-PCB. That became required by federal law in 1984 onward, so that any new transformers built from that period on had to use other than a PCB coolant, and they had to be so labeled. So here was a relatively new transformer. What was it doing there? We went inside the old power station because the original system was run with its own power generated in the station, and I documented this to show you what it was like, they once used. There were 4 huge diesel electric generators. Each generator alone was capable of the round object in the front, most of them covered with paper because they tried to preserve them, capable of putting out 3 to 4 megawatts each, and they kept 3 essentially online and a 4th as standby. But even that caused them problems. They eventually abandoned it and went to Lilco for power. The famous circle, as it is today, meeting in January, rather overgrown. Little evidence of maintenance other than they kept the grass mowed in certain locations. Now that raises a good question. Why are they mowing the grass on an abandoned base? We went over to the cliffs, and this is where the fishermen go, and it gives you some idea of the height at that point from the ocean. And looking the other way, sorry, not quite yet. This is part of the underground bunkers that we looked at. These are semi-underground, and they're important because this old ammunition bunker was converted for the Montauk project to an area where they held the kids which were part of the project, namely brainwashing and programming kids between the ages of 12 and 16 for unknown projects in the future. They were brought in here, they were beaten into submission in this room, a 5-sided room. There are some who remember it today living on Long Island. And eventually, they had bleachers here so they could have others watch and say that would happen to them if they didn't give in to the programming. And as we walked down this long hallway, we documented a number of things. Wrecks, part of equipment still appearing to be usable, and many sections of rooms with ceilings coming down in some parts. This was the long hallway. Some of the remaining furniture. One room with the ceiling coming down, we don't know why. And this was another offshoot room, went into other parts. It was a huge underground installation, truly only partially underground. It was not deep underground. We could walk in from the surface. Electrical equipment still operational, or appearing to be operational. This lady, Helga Morrow, was a world-famous psychic. She went along with us on this trip in January because I'd been there before and Preston had, but neither she nor Duncan had been in this section after the project was over. And she was interested because her father, Dr. Cooters, that's her maiden name, we found had been part of the project and was a technical director. There's an interesting story there I won't go into because she does in her own videotape. But we went down to the end of this hall, and this was where they held the kids after the beating. Some survived it and some didn't, some died. And this was wire mesh with a locked door, and they were held in this pen on these pallets, as you see here, and many of them did not survive. Talk about Auschwitz, we had our own on Long Island. And this was Helga and Preston walking down to the end of this section to another dead-end wall. And Duncan holding the lamp like Diogenes. He later broke down into crying, which is on the videotape we have. This is the famous Montauk Lighthouse, authorized by George Washington. It still stands after 200 years. And the Air Force likes to say all of this eastern end of the island is sand. They couldn't have any underground installations. Well, if you look carefully, you'll see that that lighthouse is built on solid rock, and it hasn't slid into the sea. There are other evidences not clear in these slides to show that there's a lot of rock on the end of the island. These are rather washed out at this point. One other interesting point, in the town of Montauk in 1926, this 8-story building was erected as an office building. It's still standing today. It's still intact. There's no cracks in the walls. If that was sand on eastern Montauk, that building would have long since cracked and been invisibly in bad shape, as has happened to some buildings built in New Orleans since World War II. But it's very much intact and very much used. In our visit back there, we found that, unlike 1977, where all the animal life fled eastern Long Island because they couldn't stand the vibes, and there were even stories of the sea mammals being very upset by the radiations from that tower. There's a few cats have come back, and they're apparently well fed by the tourists, as you can probably see from the picture, and we've even caught a picture of one deer. So animal life is beginning to return. This was part of the production crew. Duncan was out on the parapet there being filmed. And we have another shot there of the excuse me, of the area down near the end, that park. But let's get now just a wee bit into the physics before I am cut off, and give you some idea of what this was all about, both in terms of the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk project. What were we really doing? We were manipulating time. Now, if you've ever had any idea about what time is about, perhaps you haven't been learned much about it. I'll give you a little better idea. P.D. Ouspensky first stated in 1931 in a book, Tertium Organum, A New Model of the Universe, that we are living in a 5-dimensional universe. The 3 physical dimensions we all know, the 4th dimension, time, which we measure with a clock, but a 5th dimension, which is an extension of that. We found that was the case at the time we did the Philadelphia experiment, and you can represent time in a rather unique way called the torus of time. This is a mathematical and visual representation, but you have time, if I use this rod, to represent the flow of time as we normally measure it forward in the 4th dimension. See, if there was no flow of time, our 3 physical dimensions would cease to exist. They are totally dependent upon the higher order, namely time, to exist. But you have another phenomena. The 5th dimension, what is it? It's a vector at right angles, a spinner, which rotates around the central vector, and its rotational speed determines the movement forward in time, which we measure with a clock. And I show it as a very good way of showing the example as a torus, a donut, if you will. You can't hear me when I'm over there. You have a spiral, which represents the fifth dimensional vector rotation. It moves as a helix forward in time. What's forward? And it's all relative. But as it goes, you generate another vector, which gives you the time which we measure. But it does something else. This shows that you can have an alternate reality. P.D., not Ouspensky, but P.D. Palooky, who wrote this book in 1989 entitled How You Can Measure Higher Orders of Space and Time and Do Your Own Investigation. The book's out of print. Had this diagram showing that there are alternate realities. The government has found this. If you go 90 degrees around the edge, you're in another reality, somewhat connected to this one, but invisible. And what we did with the Philadelphia experiment, and this does not bear a direct relationship to Montauk, but an indirect one, was we phase shifted the position and time of that ship due to the fields around it. So if you go about 60 degrees, the ship becomes invisible to sight and to radar, but it's still physically there. If you could get up to the ship, you could knock on it and feel it. At Montauk, they went a little bit further. They were controlling the helix and other factors so that they not only were moving through time, they were controlling the physical location. I do not know the math for that, and I don't know how they did it. Preston Nichols does. And he may one day write a technical book covering this. He said he would. But this helix represents a way of measuring and showing what we mean by time and the fact that you can have an alternate reality that even splits off. Minkowski as well as Hilbert stated this. You can have multiple realities and multiple universes. And this is one way of representing it and showing it. Perhaps a little technical for you, but I'm trying to give you some idea of what we're involved in. That's the end of the slide, so if we can have the lights back on. I would like to state that we do have a book entitled The Montauk Project, which gives a history of the project at Montauk, how it started and how it ended and what went on in between, at least some part of it. It's only slightly technical, and it gives you some idea of what was involved. Who funded this thing? It's a very good question. Many of you may have that question in mind. Do you remember that in 1944, and there was a documentary movie made of this, that there was a American railroad train that went through a French railroad tunnel carrying Reichsbank gold, $10 billion worth of it, and the then value of gold in Europe, about $25 an ounce. The train was dynamited in the tunnel. 51 GIs were killed, and the gold disappeared. Patton got in on the investigation. He knew something was very wrong. He could never get to the bottom of it. He never found the gold. He couldn't find out who was in back of it, but he did find eventually himself dead. He was murdered for his efforts. That gold disappeared and turned up 10 years later off of Montauk, Long Island, in a sinking ship about a mile off in a fog. And the scuba divers from Fort Hero went out, perhaps knew what was coming and knew it was there. Anyway, they recovered the gold. And that $10 billion in gold, valued at European prices in 1944, as the price of gold went up, became valued at something in excess of $100 billion. That money was used to finance the entire project until they ran out, and they did run out. Who then picked it up? I'm sure you've all heard of ITT Corporation. They were the principal contractor for all of the electronics for this project, and they provided all of the connecting links, if you will, to the various subcontractors. And when the money ran out, they went back to the parent owners, who were the Krupps of Germany, and they provided the rest of the money to keep the project going. Not 1 cent of U.S. government money was ever spent on this project. There were a lot of government people there, including the intelligence people, and the Air Force, and Navy, and Army, but their salaries were paid from other funds from other locations. The hardware was all purchased on this private funding, and because of that, Senator Goldwater could never find any trace anywhere in the records of the Senate or the House of any such project or how it was paid for. But they did find eventually that ITT was involved, and as a result of that, ITT Corporation was broken up, AIL was in process, and some other companies were broken. We're about out of time. I'm being, I think, reminded by this good gentleman to my right that our time is up. We have books on the Montauk Project, tapes from previous lectures, and other material which we have available until such time as we are told to get out of the auditorium. I thank you very much for your attendance, and I hope I've been of some help in giving you some insight.
Thank you, Al. If we didn't do something.
Small step away from communism or Nazism. As the head of the Labor Socialist Party, John Strachey, who was also a leading communist of the 1930s, he said, we can't go directly from communism, from capitalism to communism. We got to use socialism as a stepping stone, so let's all work to be good socialists. Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, Castro, Daniel Ortega, either